Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we discussed about what is JWT and how this JWT will be used in the applications for security. JWT stands for JSON Web Tokens. That is an open industry standard to secure applications, guys. So here, this security is called token-based security. So whenever a client send a request for authentication, our server is going to validate the client. And if the client is giving the valid credentials, the client authentication will be successful. On successful authentication, our API will generate a JWT token along with a header, payload, and secret. Will send the token to the client. Then client will store that token, and that token will have some expiry date also. When the client want to access any secured REST API, then client will send a request along with the token. Then server side, we are going to validate that token. If the token is valid, then only the request will be processed. Otherwise, that request will not be processed. In order to generate the token, we are using one class called JWT service class. In order to validate the token, we are using one filter called once per request filter. Okay. Now this is JWT service class. So you don't need to remember all this logic, guys. Just you can, I have taken this code from the Google, how to write the logic in order to generate the token. And here at the time of generating the token, we are setting the subject. Inside the subject, we are setting the username. So for which user we are generating the token, and when this token is issued, and what is the expiration of this token also. So the token limit we are providing. Current time in milliseconds plus 1000 multiplied by 60 by 1. We are setting the expiry date also for this token. So you remember, inside the token, we are adding the username and we are setting the expiration also. And we are having a method which is used to validate the token. So we are passing the username, and in the token, some username is available. Whatever the username we are passing, whatever the username is available in the token, those both are matching or not, and the token is expired or not, we are going to validate. If username contains, if username available in the token, and if the token expiry date is not crossed, then the token is valid token. So that logic is available inside our JWT service class. So as discussed yesterday, in our application, we have created one entity class for table mapping. We created one repository interface to communicate with the database, and we created one service in that our business logic will be available. And we created one customer REST controller in that login method, registration methods available, security configuration class available, bcryptor password encoder, auth provider, auth manager we configured, filter chain also we configured. We are allowing any request which is coming to /API/register, and we are allowing any request which is coming to /API and /login. Okay. We have total 3 URL patterns in our application. In the REST controller, welcome is available, login is available, registration is available. Welcome URL pattern is a secured URL pattern for us. If any request comes with login or register, then that should be allowed. And if you want to access welcome URL, you need to send the token in the request. Without a token, you cannot access that welcome method. That logic we have created in the security filter chain bin. And in the JWT service, as we have seen, there are 2 methods available, and you can't butify this logic, you can't remember. Just you can refer the internet. I have also taken this code from the internet, which is used to generate the token. In that, we are setting our username and we are setting our expiry date of the token. And the next one, there is an important class in this project, which is called a filter. What is the purpose of this filter? Yesterday, theoretically, we understood this filter will execute when the request comes for our application, and it is going to check for the token in the request. Okay. If the token is available, then it will verify the token and it will process the request. If the token is not available, or if the token is invalid, that request will not be processed. And the client application is going to send the token to the server in this format. Header will be authorization, value is bearer is equal to that token that we are going to send. Now, let me go to this filter and let me implement that logic. Okay, so I'm removing all the logic that is available in the filter. So what we need to do in this filter? What is the purpose of this filter first? This filter is responsible. This filter is responsible to verify the token. Whatever the token is coming, we are going to verify the token. First of all, if you see, we are extending the properties from once per request filter. So that means for every request, this filter is going to execute. Now I'm going to read the request. From the request, I'm going to get the header. Request dot get a header. What is the name of the header? The header name is authorization. The header name is authorization. I'm reading the request here. Okay. From the request, I'm reading the header. So if the header is not equal to null, and if the header starts with the bearer, that means it is a bearer token. If a header is not equal to null, and if a header dot starts with the token value starts with bearer space. Okay, that means the bearer token is coming for us. You got my point. So I'm reading authorization header from the request and I'm checking the header is present or not. Header not equal to null and header starts with a bearer. If a header is starting with the bearer, then I need to read the actual header value. Okay, so I'm checking whether this authorization header is available or not. If the header value is not equal to null, and if it is starting with the bearer space, then I want to read actual token from here. So when I get the header of authorization, complete header I will get. From the header value, I want to get only the token now. To get the token, I will do some substring here. Okay, header dot substring of length, from which character you want to get the text from the substring. Okay, if you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 characters contains bearer space. From the 7th character, I want to get the remaining data. I want to get only this data. For that, I will use substring of 7. So I will get the actual token from the value. Value contains bearer space token. I don't want this bearer and space. It is just to remember that this is just to recognize that this is a bearer token. I want to get the actual token from the value. So that's why I'm doing substring. Now let me store that into one variable, string token. Okay, so token is equal to header dot substring of 7. So with this, what logic is available in the filter? We are getting authorization header value. From that value, we are checking it is starting with the bearer or not. If it is starting with the bearer, then I'm getting the actual value from that. Okay, then from that token, I want to extract the username. Okay, inside the at the time of token generation, we are adding username in the subject, right? Now I want to extract that username. To extract the username, there is one method available in the JWT service. Okay, so let me go here, use JWT service dot extract username. Okay, so I'm going to pass token. From the token, it should give me username. So let me store that username also into one variable. Okay, first I'm getting the actual token from the header value. From that actual token, I'm getting the username. Okay, are you guys clear with this logic now? Come on, could you please confirm? Are you guys clear with this logic? How to get the header value and how to get the actual token from the value, and from that token how to get the username. Are you able to understand this code? Are you guys able to understand this code? Come on guys. Okay. So once we got the username, now we need to verify that user record is available in the database or not. Okay, and we will verify the token is valid or not. So what I'm going to do here, if username is not equal to null in the token, and if a security authentication is null, okay, if a username is not equal to null in our application, then I'm using security context holder dot get context dot get authentication. Okay, if security authentication is null, okay, if security authentication is null, that means user is not authenticated as of now. Now we need to verify this user, whatever the username we retrieved, this user is a valid user or not, we need to verify. So for that, we are having user details service, load user by username. We are getting user record. From the user service, we are getting our user record, guys. Already in our user service, we have a method to load the user record from the database. So we are retrieving that user record from the database. User details we got. Once we got the user details, we are going to verify that the user details are matching with the token details or not. JWT service dot validate token method is available. We are passing that validate token method with the token and user details as a parameter. Okay, so boolean is valid. The token is valid or not, we are getting. Right? So if username is not equal to null, we are extracting username from the token. If username is not equal to null, and if security authentication is null for the user, then we are loading user record by using username, and we are verifying user with the token and user details. Validate token method is available. So here we are checking the username and we are checking the expiry time of that user. Now, if this token is valid, then we will update the authentication. That means we will say that boss, he is a valid user, his token is valid. Okay, if the token is valid, then we will update that authentication saying that token is valid, then proceed with the request processing. So for this, what we are going to do, we are going to create a authentication token and we will update the authentication token. Here, authentication is null. Now I need to update the authentication token if the token is valid. Right? How to update that authentication here? Username and password authentication token will be available, which is auth token is equal to new username and password authentication token. User details we are going to supply and credentials we are not passing, and user details dot get authorities will be available. Any roles which are available for the application. So we are creating password authentication here. Okay. We are adding password authentication here. So once this token is available, because the token is validated, token is valid. If the token is valid, then what I will tell, authentication successful, user token is valid, you proceed with the request processing. So how to do that? By using auth token dot set authenticated, auth token dot set authenticated is completed, auth token dot set details. Set details, new web authentication details, authentication details source is available, web authentication details source dot build. We'll set that token. We are going to build the details with the request. Once it is done, then we are going to update the security context. Security context holder dot get context dot set authentication with the authentication token object. With authentication token object, we are setting that. Okay. If username not equal to null and security context authentication is equal to null, username is equal to extract username. So here we are extracting the username, storing into variable, and if username is not equal to null, and if authentication is equal to null, we are loading the user record from the table and we are validating the token. If the token is valid, we are creating the token object and we are setting that token object with the request details, and we are setting the authentication as authentication successful. Okay, then finally filter chain dot do filter. So what will happen? Whenever the request comes to our application, it will verify. So to get authentication is available or not. Here we are setting the authentication. If authentication is available, then the request will be processed. If the authentication is not available, then request will not be processed. That is the meaning of this filter logic. Okay, so whenever a request comes to our application, our security filter chain will verify security context holder authentication is available or not. If authentication is null, the request will not be processed. If authentication is not null, request will be processed. So by default, authentication will be null in the security context. If the token is valid, then we are updating that authentication with the token object. Then the request will be processed. Otherwise, that request will not be processed. So here, the logic is available in the filter. We are reading the authorization header and we are checking that a header is available or not. And if the header is available, we are checking whether it is starting with the bearer or not. If it is starting with the bearer, then we are getting the actual token. From the actual token, we are extracting the username. And we are checking username is not equal to null and security context holder dot get authentication is null or not. Okay, if authentication is null by default, then we are going to verify the token. If the token is valid, we are updating the authentication. Okay, if authentication by default, if the header is not available, if the token is not valid, authentication will be null. If authentication is null, request will not be processed. If authentication is not null, then only the request will be processed. Okay, now let us check this. Let us check this one, guys. I'm keeping one breakpoint here. Now let me execute this application, debug as boot application, and we will see that the request is coming to the filter or not, and how the request is executing, we will verify. Go to our application. It is started and application is running in the debug mode. Go to this and application is started and application is running in the debug mode. Now let us go and send a get request by default without any token. Okay, I'm sending a request without any token. I'm accessing a welcome request. In our application, welcome URL is a secured URL pattern. Click on send. I have sent a request for our application. Request came to filter. Now there is no token in the request, but the filter logic is executing. Let us see how the filter is working here. F6, get the header value from the request. Header is coming as null because we are not sending any token in the request. We are not sending any token in the request. So header is not equal to null, but actually header is null. Username is not available. So the token is not available. This condition will not satisfy. This condition also will not satisfy. Directly it will go to filter chain dot to do filter. Okay, now authentication is updated or authentication is not updated, guys. For this welcome request, authentication is updated, authentication is not updated. What is the authentication status now for this request? It is null. What is the authentication status now? Authentication status is not updated because the header itself is not available. If the header itself is not available, by default authentication status will be null only. If authentication status is null, request will be processed or request will not be processed. If authentication status is null, request will be processed or request will not be processed. will not get processed. Security filter chain will check authentication is updated or not. So, but here the token is not available, authentication is not updated, so the request will not be processed. Now you can see the request is not processed because we are getting 403 forbidden. This welcome is a secured URL pattern. For this, authentication is not updated. That's why the request is not processed. Now let me send get request with the body. Now send the request. Now for this, this is a wrong URL pattern, guys. This is a wrong URL pattern. We need to send the request for welcome. Okay, forbidden. So login request I have to send. Post login request. Now I'm sending the data. For this URL, authentication is required or authentication not required for this URL. Authentication is required for this URL. Authentication is not required for this URL. Not required. Anyone can access this URL directly. So here it is checking. Here it is checking the token is available or not. Token is not available. Token is not available. But still, request will be processed or request will not be processed. For welcome, token is not available. Request is not processed. For the login, token is not available. Login request will be processed or login request will not be processed here. Token is not available. Login request will be processed or login request will not be processed here. Will be processed because security not required. We are permitting this URL. We are allowing this URL. Security is not required for this. So that's why login request will be processed. When the login request is processed, then the token will be generated and we will get the token in the response. Now we got the token in the response. For welcome, authentication should be not null. For login, it will process. No need to check the authentication because this is a public URL we are allowing. Now take this token. Now send the get request with the token. Okay, go to authorization. Now we are going to use bearer token. So we are passing the new token and click on send. Now we are sending the request. Request will go to the filter. Now check it. In the filter, header value is coming or not. Yes, I got the header value. Bearer token value is available. So request.get a header of key. We are getting the value. From that value, I want to get the actual token. So if a header is not equal to null, if a header value starts with the bearer, I'm getting the actual token. From the actual token, I'm extracting my username. So Raju is the username. This is a Raju token. This is a Raju token. We are extracting the username here. Once we extract that username, we are checking authentication status. By default, the authentication status will be null value. Then we are extracting the user record from the database. We are extracting user record from the database by calling our service method. Once we extract the user record from the database, you see select query is executed. We are going to validate the token along with the user details. Okay. So the username available in the database and the username available in the token, is it matching or not? So then we are verifying that token is valid or not. If the token is valid, that means we are going to update the authentication status. If the token is valid, we are going to update the authentication status. Okay. Expired JWT exception. So whatever the token we are sending, the token is already expired. So when 1 minute of limit we have given, the token got expired. So as the token is expired, the request is not getting processed. The token is expired. 1 minute limit is available. So the token got expired. So that's why we are not able to process this request. Now we need to send another login request. Then only we will get the new token. Okay, send that request. Then simply F8. Then I want to get the new token. /login post request /login. Send a login request. /API/login username and password Let me stop my server once. Yeah. I'm sending the request. I'm starting my application again. Clear this console. Send a login request. Forbidden. Oh, sorry, I'm passing the token. I should not pass the token. For login, token should not be available. Yeah, token I am passing. Now immediately send a get request along with the bearer token. Now send that request. This is a /welcome, right? URL pattern is welcome. I'm sending the welcome request along with the token. So when I send it, the request is processed. I'm able to get the message, welcome to Ashok IT. For login request, you should not send the token. If the token is coming in the request, we are validating. If the token is coming in the request, we are validating the token. So if the token is not available, then we no need to validate, directly it will be processed. So are you able to understand the logic available class? Guys, are you able to understand the logic available in the filter class? Reading the token, validating the token. If the token is valid, we are updating the security context. Okay, if for the secured URLs, security context should be updated. For security URL, security context should be updated. JWT service is not a predefined class. This is a user-defined class. I have taken this code from internet. It's not a predefined class. This is a user-defined class that we have created in our application. Right. Very good, guys. So I hope we are good with how the JWT token is getting used in our applications. You are able to understand how JWT token is getting used in our applications. Now, so this is a single application. This is a single application in which we are generating the token and we are validating the token. So this is a single REST API, and in this application, we are having the functionality to generate the token and we are having the functionality to validate the token also. But tomorrow, when we are developing microservices based applications, tomorrow when you are developing microservice based applications, then how to deal with the tokens. Okay, for example, there is one products API is available. Products API is available. Assume that there are multiple microservices available. One is products API, another one is cart API is available, and another one is orders API is available. So in my application, multiple microservices are available. Products API is available. Products API, where we are having the functionality to get all the products and all. And the next one, we are having checkout API. The customers will check out the products from the application and they want to purchase the products. They want to place the orders. So order processing, get the orders history of the customer. For that, we are having orders API. Now, for this one, for this application, this is a microservices based application here. These are the backend services available. Okay, now for these backend services, there is one front-end application is also available. That is UI application is available here. Now, when we are having microservices based application like this, then how do you implement security? Currently, whatever the example that we have seen, here we have taken only one REST API. In that REST API, we have the functionality to generate the token and validate the token. But in the reality, our application will be developed by using microservices architecture. Then how to implement security for our microservices architecture based application? Anybody having idea? How to implement the security for microservices architecture based application? How to implement security for microservices based application? So when we are having microservices architecture, when we are having microservices based architecture, then we are going to create one API, separate API in our application, that is called authentication API. Auth API will be available in our project. Okay, so we are going to create one separate API in our project. In this separate API, we will have the functionality. We will have the functionality for user registration and user login. The user registration, user login details will be available in the authentication API. So whatever the logic that we have implemented now, that user login method and user registration method, JWT token generation method, all these methods will be available as part of one API called, that is called authentication API. Okay, so your application is having multiple microservices: product API, checkout API, order API, payment API, admin API, cancellation API, reports API. Multiple APIs can be available in your application. So multiple APIs can be available in your application. Along with those APIs, we are going to implement one separate API in our project, that is called Auth API. Separate API we are going to implement in our application, that is called Auth API. So what is the responsibility of this Auth API in our project? What is the responsibility of Auth API in our project? So this API will contain URL patterns. This API will contain the logic to, this API will contain the logic. This API will contain the logic for user login and user registration, guys. Token generation part and user registration part, authentication part, that we are going to implement as part of Auth API. Whatever the code we have used in the JWT, same code will be available. Nothing, just it will be in the separate API. So in this API, what is the logic we are going to write? User registration logic, user login method will be available. So when you go for this user registration and user login, token generation is also part of the authentication API. Then whenever the request is coming to our backend microservices, to handle the request of the application in our microservices architecture, for all the backend microservices, entry point will be available, that is API gateway. Entry point will be available as API gateway. So this API gateway is responsible to validate the request. Whatever the request is coming, is it a valid request or not? That API gateway is responsible to validate. Inside the API gateway, we are going to create a filter, and that filter we are going to use in order to validate the request. So earlier in the single application, token generation is available, token validation is available. But when it comes to microservices architecture, the token generation will be part of the authentication API, token validation will be part of the API gateway. Okay, now whenever the UI application is sending a request, it will go to the API gateway. Okay, in the API gateway, there will be a filter. That filter is used to validate our token. If the token is valid, then only that request will be processed. If the token is not valid, then the request will not be processed. So here in the current application, whatever that we have implemented now, token generation, token validation available in the single project. But when we are developing a project by using microservices architecture, this is the implementation. So one separate API we are going to create, that is called Auth API. Auth API will contain the functionality to user registration and user login, whatever we have done in the last week example and in the JWT example, registration and login. User will be registered, record will be inserted into table. User will log in, Spring security authentication will happen. If authentication is successful, token will be generated, token will be sent to the client. When the user sending the request with the token will be validated. Where is the validation logic? Validation logic we are going to do by using API gateway. So you understand, guys, how security will be implemented in microservice based application. If your application is monolith application, same concept. Within the application, token generation is available, token validation also available by using filter. If your application is a microservice based application, the token generation will be part of one API, token validation will be part of API gateway. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? How the security will be implemented in the microservices architecture. So if your application is only one, if you have a single application, then token generation, token validation will be part of single application. Okay. If your application is a microservices based application, token generation will be part of one API called Auth API. Token validation will be part of API gateway. What is the API gateway in the project? That is entry point for all the backend microservices. When any request comes to our application, that will go to the API gateway. In that API gateway, filter will be available. Filter will be available. What will be there in the filter? We have implemented the code now, reading the header value and checking the token. Token is valid or not. If token is valid, proceed with the request processing. Otherwise, stop the request processing. That logic we will do inside the filter. Now, security starters, we no need to add in the product API, checkout API, order API. For those APIs, security will be, those APIs will be private. Directly, nobody can access those APIs. If they want to access our API, the request should come through API gateway only. In the API gateway, filter will be available. In that filter, we have the logic to validate the token. And for example, product API. So when you go for Amazon application, products, do we need security to access all the products which are available in the Amazon? To access all the products available in the Amazon, do we need a security for that? Or anybody can access the products available in the Amazon? Guys, so products, do we need security to access the products, or products anybody can access? Products anybody can access. So for this product API, security is required. For the products API, security is not required. For the products API, security is not required. Checkout. Can anybody do the checkout? Yes. If you want to check the orders, your orders, then you need to authenticate. Only for the orders API, security is required. Only for the orders API, security is required. For product API, security is not required. For checkout API, security is not required. For orders API, security is required. And admin functionality is available. For admin functionality or for generating the admin reports, there is a reports API is available. Now, out of these 5 APIs, for which API security is required? Out of these 5 APIs, for which APIs security is required? Can I say security is required for only orders API and reports API? For the remaining 3, security is not required. Are you guys getting my point? So in my microservices architecture, there are 5 APIs available. In my microservices architecture, there are 5 APIs are available. One is product API, another one is checkout API, third one is orders API. One is orders API. Now, auth API is available. What is the responsibility of auth API? What is the responsibility of auth API? It is responsible to generate the token. Where the token will be validated? Where the token will be validated? The token will be validated at the API gateway. So to validate the token in the API gateway, we are going to create a filter. For which API token is required? Only for orders and reports. For products, for checkout, for authentication API, token validation not required. So in the API gateway, inside the API gateway, we will configure that this filter should work when the request comes to order API, and when the request comes to reports API, then only my filter should be executed. Otherwise, my filter should not execute. So for the product API, for checkout API, for auth API, security not required. So I will specify that inside the API gateway, we have a filter to verify the request, whether it is secured or not. That filter should be executed only when the request comes for order API, when the request comes for the reports API. When the request comes for the other APIs, no need to execute the filter. You got the point? If a request comes to order API, then only my filter should be executed. If the request coming for reports API, then my filter should be executed. When the request is coming for product API, checkout API, auth API, my filter no need to execute. So filter is specific to particular APIs only in our project. But in the current application, single application, filter is executing for every request. But in the reality, API gateway filter should not execute for every request. If a request comes to order API, then only filter should execute. If request comes to reports API, then only filter should be executed. When the request is coming for non-secured APIs, filter no need to execute. That we are going to configure in the orders API. You got the overview? How security will be implemented in the microservices based application. For token generation, auth API will be available. For token validation, API gateway will be available. Inside the API gateway, filter will be available. That filter I don't want to execute for every request. If request comes to order API, if request comes to reports API, then only my filter should be executed. Otherwise, my filter should not execute. So if anybody asks you, how do you implement the security in the microservices? You need to explain this diagram. If anybody asks you, how do you implement security for your application? If your application is a monolithic application, already we have done this. JWT token concept we have implemented. Okay, if it is a single API, JWT token generation, token validation will be part of single project. But if our application is microservices application, if your application is a microservice based application, then we have a auth API in the project. In the auth API, user registration and user login functionalities will be available. So when user send a request for the login, credentials will be validated, authentication will be verified. If authentication is successful, token will be generated for the client and we will send the token in the response. When user send a request along with the token, that will go to API gateway. in the API gateway, my filter will be available to validate the token. That too, that filter will not execute for every API request. Only we have few secured APIs in the project like order API, report API, admin API. That filter will be executed for particular API only. If any request comes to the products API, my filter will not execute because anybody can access the products, token is not required. If request comes for the reports API, that is the admin API, then my filter will be executed to validate the token. If the token is valid, then only the request will be processed. Otherwise, the request will not be processed. Are you guys able to follow me? Concept-wise, are you clear? How microservices will be secured? Concept-wise, are you clear? How microservices will be secured in the real time? Springwood people, we already discussed about microservices architecture, API gateway, and all that stuff. And yesterday we have seen, in the last session, we have seen how to implement registration login with the Spring Security, and we have seen what is the JWT and here. Okay. Now, for this microservices implementation with the security, in the notes, I have given Git repository link, guys. Uploaded Spring Security notes in the GitHub repository, right? So if you go to our GitHub repository, in the class notes, I have given Spring Security workshop, Spring Security notes available. In this Spring Security notes, microservices security Git repository I have given. JWT is available. Microservices with JWT security. Okay. Now, so this is the project which is having JWT with microservices implementation. So if you see microservices security, we are having service registry with Eureka server, config server to get the configuration properties from the Git repository, welcome API, greet API, authentication service, and API gateway is available. So this is service registry where all the microservices will be available. This is a config server to load the configuration properties from the GitHub repository. We already implemented all these things in our course. And welcome API, greet API is available. Authentication service, as we discussed, auth API, authentication service. If you go to our authentication service, you can find the logic in the authentication service, which contains logic for token generation. Okay, register method available, user record will be created, token method is available, which is going to verify the user, which will send the token for the user. So token generation is part of authentication service. API gateway is available. Inside the API gateway, we have a filter. That filter is responsible. Authentication filter is available. That filter is responsible to verify the token. Token is valid or not. If the token is valid, request will be processed. If the token is not valid, it will throw the error, unauthorized request. So this filter should be executed for which APIs. In the properties file, we are going to configure. So whenever the request comes to /welcome API, then only the filter should be executed. When the request comes for the greet API, the filter should be executed. When the request comes for authentication API, filter should not be executed. For which API filter should be executed, we are configuring that in the API gateway routings configuration. Which request should go to which API? If a request comes to the welcome API, if a request comes with the /welcome URL, it should go to welcome API. For that, a filter should be executed. It will verify the token. That means in our project, welcome API is a secured API. Without a token, your request will not be processed. When request comes with /welcome, it should go to welcome API. Authentication filter is available. And when request comes with /greet, it will go to greet API. For that, a filter will be executed. When the request comes with authentication for login and registration, directly that request will be processed. Filter will not be executed. So for out of 3 microservices, we are applying the filter for 2 microservices. For authentication API, we are not applying the filter. So for which microservice that filter should be executed, we are managing that in the YML file. So whatever the filter we created to validate, same thing. Whatever the filter we created, that is same thing. But for which API that filter, for which API request filter should be executed, we are managing in our application.yml file. So when the request comes to welcome API, filter will execute. When the request comes for the greet API, filter will execute. When the request comes for authentication API, filter will not execute because anybody can register, anybody can log in. It's very simple configuration in the YML file. It's very simple configuration in the YML. For which API request, filter should be executed. For which API request, filter should not execute. We are managing in the YML file of the API gateway. So the token generation part is available in the authentication API. So whenever request comes to the authentication API, my filter will not execute. I have not applied filter for the auth API. Directly request can go to auth API. User can register, user can log in. When the request comes to the order API, I applied filter, token will be validated. If the token is valid, then only request will be processed. If the token is not valid, then the request will not be processed. Microservices with JWT security. Okay, so how we are implementing microservices with the JWT security? Spring security with the JWT we have seen. So if it is a single application, very simple. And when you go for microservices, how we are going to do this? So here in the microservices with the JWT security, so we are having one API called welcome API. We are having one API called welcome API. This is secured REST API. And we are having one more API called greet API. This is also secured REST API. Welcome API is available and greet API is available, secured REST API, and we are having auth API not secured. No, anyone can access. Anyone can access for register plus login. Anyone can access for register plus login. And then now we are having API gateway here to valid API gateway. It is, we can say, entry point for our microservices, entry point for backend microservices, and request validation with the filter plus request routing logic will be available in the API gateway. In our microservices classes, we discussed about this API gateway that will act as an entry point for backend microservices. Inside the API gateway, request validation logic available with the filter and request routing logic is also available. Okay. Now here in the API gateway routings, whenever if request comes for auth API, execution, direct forward the request, direct forward. Okay, if request comes for welcome API, which is a secured API, filter will execute validate request, validate token. Okay, and if request comes for greet API, then also my filter will execute. Then here also we are going to validate the token. So filter is available in the API gateway to validate the token. But when that filter will execute, so I have taken 3 microservices here. One is welcome API, another one is greet API. When the request comes for the welcome API, which is a secured REST API, token required. Secured REST API, token required. Token required to access. Greet API, secured REST API. For this also, token required access. Auth API, no need of token. Token not required. Token not required. So API gateway, which is entry point for backend microservices. Inside the API gateway, there is a filter to validate the token and routing logic is available. Filter should be applied only for the secured REST APIs. For the authentication API, filter is not required. Anybody can access. So where we are managing this configuration, guys? In the code or in the YML? Filter is a Java class. What about this filter should be applicable for only 2 APIs, not for other APIs? Filter should be executed for all the APIs in the backend, or filter should be executed for only few APIs in the backend? Come on, guys. Filter should be applied for only few APIs. So where we will do that configuration? Filter should be applied for only for this API, not for all the APIs. Where we will write that configuration, filter should be applied for only few APIs, not for all the APIs. Inside the API gateway YML file. So you got the clarity how microservices will be secured in the real time, how a project will be secured in the real time with the JWT. Yes. So today I want all of you to clone my Git repository, which contains microservices security implementation. I want to execute that project and see whether you are able to do that or not. Okay, in the tomorrow session, I will be demonstrating on this microservices security execution flow. So I have another meeting at 9:30, guys. So I will stop for now. In the tomorrow morning, again, tomorrow morning we have a class at 8 a.m. In the tomorrow morning, first 30 minutes, I will show microservices security, microservices application execution with the JWT. Execution flow, I will show you. Because coding already we have done in the JWT, same code only, there is nothing to do. Just I will run this application and I will show you the execution flow. And after that, I will explain about OAuth security implementation. Okay, good. Thank you. So today, I want all of you to go through the notes that I have given for Spring Security. In that notes, JWT example with the single REST API is available. JWT with the microservices example is also available. I want you to go through those 2 projects and try to do them on your own. In the tomorrow session, I will run my microservices security based application. The Git repository is already available here for you. So this is a Git repository. In that microservices examples with the JWT available. I want you to run that application and check it how it is working. So in the tomorrow session, I will demonstrate on that execution flow and we will discuss about OAuth. Tomorrow is the last session for our Spring Security. Okay, good. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.